Lara Ehrlich is the author of Animal Wife, which won Red Hen Press's Fiction Award, judged by Anne Hood, and was published by the press in September 2020. By the way, this is my edition. It has an absolutely beautiful cover, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already. Lara is also the host of Writer, Mother, Monster, a conversation series devoted to dismantling the myth of having it all and offering writer moms solidarity, support, and advice as they make space for creative endeavors. A woman of very many talents, Lara is also the director of marketing for the International Festival of Arts and Ideas, which is based here in Connecticut, and she lives there with her husband and daughter. Of course, she'll be in conversation with Beatriz Williams, our guest of honor. We just adore her at RJ Julia. She's the best-selling author of 13 novels, including Her Last Flight, The Summer Wives, and The Golden Hour, as well as All the Ways We Said Goodbye, co-written with Lauren Willig and also Karen White, who RJ Julia hosted earlier this year. She's a native of Seattle, and she graduated from Stanford and earned an MBA in finance from Columbia. She lives with her husband and 4 children near the Connecticut shore. And I always love this last bit, where she divides her time between writing and laundry. And of course, the book of the hour is The Wicked Widow, number 3 in the Wicked City series. Jen Kelly, the Wicked Redhead, is back, ladies and gentlemen. What ugly secrets lurk in the opulent enclaves and bank accounts of America's richest families? Can 2 determined women from 2 different generations thwart the murderous legacy of the demon liquor? Publishers Weekly says Williams' fast-paced storyline features engaging dialogue and thematic connections between Ella and Geneva. Series fans will eat this up. So RJ Julia, Wesley and RJ Julia, and BookHampton are very grateful to have Beatriz and Lara here in conversation today. I'm going to let you 2 take it away, and I will be back later for Q&A. So have fun.
Thank you, Abby.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Abby. I'm very excited to be here with Lara and with all of you wonderful RJ Julia readers. We're so grateful, and I think I speak for both of us, that we have such a tremendous independent bookseller in our neck of the woods, and we certainly hope you will support them. It is, I think, Small Business Saturday was a couple of days ago, but we can obviously support our local booksellers at any time. They're, as you know, the ones who really support our books with a lot of hand selling and kind of grassroots readership. So we're very grateful for that. So thanks for joining us today.
Great message. Hi, Beatriz. It's so nice to meet you in person or virtual.
Yes, on a screen. It almost feels like in person. And we're so used to this that this all seems very natural to be talking to a photograph on a screen.
It does, in front of people we can't see, and we actually don't know how many.
But we know you're there. We hope you're there.
So I'm so excited to talk with you about The Wicked Widow. I'm going to hold this up. This is I think the ARC version, but as you guys heard.
Oh, I think I put my copy. Where did I put oh, here it is. I set it on the floor. Woohoo. Okay, there we go. Sorry, unprepared.
Oh, beautiful. Okay.
Sorry, I was just saying, so my husband has started using my Zoom station, so I may have to make little adjustments because he's much taller than I am, but there we go. That's a little better. Not just like a pair of shoulders and a head. Okay, there we go. The Wicked Widow. There it is.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah, and so we heard a little synopsis of it, which I was going to ask you for, but Abby's a pro and she already took that away for us. So let's jump right into the story and the research behind this amazing, complex, multi-generational work here. Tell us just, where do we start? Well, let me ask you from the craft perspective first, because there's, I imagine, so much research that went into particularly the 20s period of this book that shuttles between different time periods. So do you start with your research? Do you jump into the story first and kind of leave spaces for areas that you'll need to go back and learn more about? How do you balance the craft of the writing with the sort of the work of the research?
Well, it's funny. And of course, this is book 3 of a series. So at this point, I'm very comfortable in the 1920s, have done that sort of top level research about the period, particularly about prohibition. So I feel very comfortable in the period. And so a lot of the research that I do for any of my books, but particularly for this one, is sort of, it's such an extended work in progress. So, I have been reading about the 1920s, and particularly the 1920s and the part that it played in what you might call the whole narrative arc of the 20th century for, years and years before I even contemplated this particular series. And it actually came about when I was writing another book set in the 1920s, which was A Certain Age. So I had to plunge deep into, okay, I kind of know a bit about Prohibition, but now that I'm writing about, a book actually set in that period, what are the specifics? What, when did it exactly start? How compliant were people? Who was pro? Who was anti? Why? How did it come about? So what, and the more you dig into Prohibition, the more you realize this is a huge subject. So I was kind of, as I was doing this more top level research for A Certain Age, it was definitely kind of getting into my head, sort of filing under future book ideas that, well, this is such a big topic. It'd be really neat to write a series about Prohibition. And not that hasn't been done before. And there are tons of, especially mystery series. I think that there's something about the 1920s that is particularly suited to that genre, the mystery genre. But I sort of wanted to do something that was a little more female centric, a little more action adventure, but also a deep psychological study. And so that's kind of how I ended up with this series. And I won't go into sort of the long version of, the spark that lit the flame. But, so I have done so much research, in general for it. And then when I did the research for The Wicked Redhead, which was the second book in the series, which was some of it very technical, because I was covering the sort of the part of Prohibition that took place on the high seas and how booze got into this very thirsty country from overseas through, the Coast Guard and all the various defenses. So by the time I sat down to write this book, The Wicked Widow, I already knew where I wanted the series to go. I knew what slice of the Prohibition experience the book was going to cover. And I had already studied a lot of that in depth. So I didn't need to necessarily tackle a lot of like fresh new ground. It was more like sort of specific things. And sometimes I will just pick up a book on the 1920s or pick up a book on Prohibition, and it will give me a bunch of ideas. And that was actually the case with this book. And it's not something that found its way. I did mention it a little bit in one of the scenes, but I was reading about the assistant attorney general of the United States at the time, who was a woman. It was the first time a woman had held this position. Obviously, she was already a lawyer, and her job was basically not to enforce, but to prosecute Prohibition. And it was very tricky because trying to figure out where all the gatekeepers were, because, at that time, in the beginning of the 1920s, beginning of Prohibition, enforcement was handled by the Treasury Department. By the end of it, a guy named J. Edgar Hoover had taken over the business of enforcing Prohibition. It had moved over to the FBI. But there's like all this, and so a lot of it was sort of technical. And I was reading this book about her and about a particular case that she had prosecuted, and it really brought about this guy in the Midwest who was. He was a bootlegger, but he was kind of doing it as he was the first guy who's like, I can do this as a business enterprise, and you're serving a customer, and you want to give them the real thing. So what you do is you buy up distilleries that have all this pre-existing inventory that was what they say bonded. So very beginning of Prohibition, these cases of booze would get bonded, they officially noted by the Treasury, and then you get a withdrawal certificate to say, okay, this is going for a legitimate purpose, medicinal purposes. For example, when Winston Churchill came over to America during Prohibition, he took care to bring a doctor's letter that said he needed a bottle of scotch a day. So for something like that, they needed the scotch, and you could officially withdraw it with your withdrawal. So he got this whole business together that he had all this like literally real wild turkey, you know, or old granddad. You can order it, and it was the real thing, and it was high quality booze. All he had to do was bribe officials to get withdrawal certificates and then get it, you know, sent over. So, you know, all this research, this was sort of the research book that made me kind of the lights were clicking on in my head about how to move my chess pieces around the board. I kind of knew where they needed to go, but how do I get them where I need to go? And that was kind of that book. So there was like a particular book that filled the slot that I needed. And then, you know, you just go to town. And the beautiful thing is if you need a specific fact, it's very easy to look up. You can just look it up either on the internet or go through your sources. You double check to make sure that it's true. But, you know, I think the internet has made that kind of specific research question a much easier job than it used to be, where you used to have to go to the library and spend a day digging through the card catalogs, you know, talking to the librarian, ordering something from another library 3 counties away, kind of a thing. Now that stuff is much easier. So that has made, I am notorious for giving very long-winded responses to questions, but it does tend to encompass all the various follow-up questions that might be asked. So the short answer, which I should have given in the beginning, is that a book like this, third in this series, I don't need to do quite as much original research as I do in the beginning. But there are certain bits you always are learning, and it is by sort of picking up books about the period, getting those ideas that kind of relights the creative fire and really gets you going. And this was definitely one of those books where it was just like slipping into another skin. And it was such a wonderful and cathartic experience returning to these characters that, you know, the research was, to me, just an interruption on the way to filling the page with these characters that I have now grown to know and love so much. And I just, you know, the whole world around them.
Yeah, no apologies at all necessary for a long answer. That's particularly when it's so eloquent and passionate. So thank you. No, that's a great answer and leads us into another question. But first, I think prohibition calls for a sip of wine. So I hope you won't mind if I drink.
You know, I usually do have, actually, I usually mix myself a gin fizz, but I got my booster shot today. Tomorrow's going to be a little rough. And I thought today I'm just going to have a little water to go. We will pretend it is straight gin or something, but I thought better to err on the side of caution, knowing what is ahead of me tomorrow.
Well, it's a good reason to abstain, so that is okay. So you talked about returning to these characters, and just I can feel the passion for them and the love for them in your voice as you talk about them, and they are such vibrant characters, all of them. And we'll get to that, but let's talk about voice a little bit, and how you craft these voices of such distinctive characters, particularly across time and space. So there is a moment, and we won't read from the book this evening, but
I can if you really want me to. We were just having a green room discussion about how, you know, I'm so in awe of the talent, of the voice talent on display in the audio versions of my books that I very rarely attempt to voice them myself, partly because the voice in my head, it's usually, you know, it's like when you sing in the shower and if somebody records you, you're like, oh my God, I don't actually sound like that. So it's the same thing, you know, like the voice in my head, it just for some reason does not quite come out of my mouth the way I imagined it. So I try not to, unless you have put a gun to my head or offer me $1 million. So
no, I won't do either of those things. But I will direct people to a point in the book where they can read for themselves when they purchase your book after this reading, or write me a link in the chat. So we start with a section about Ella, who is the contemporary character. And then there's a shift about 30 pages or so in, where we shift to another character, Ginny, who is from the 20s.
Yes.
And there's this amazing voice shift. Immediately, you know that you are reading about someone different, from a different perspective and a different time and place, from so many cues on the page, not least of which being just her it's not slang, but her way of speaking, I guess, the words that she uses, her her pacing.
Yeah, her syntax and grammar, and it's all, it's funny. When I first went to create Jin, I knew she was going to be she would have been raised in Appalachia, and as she says, the far western corner of Maryland, but that she has a link to New York City. She was conceived in New York City. Her stepfather brought her up in Appalachia, but she went to convent school from the time she was about 10 years old, and she even had a year at Bryn Mawr. She was told that this was paid for by a scholarship, but she never believed that because she wasn't exactly a scholarship student. But she's a bit rebellious, as we know. So, when I even sort of sat down, I tried not to overthink her voice too much. I tried to braid in elements of the Appalachian dialect, and that I did study. I mean, I'd heard it often before, but I was like, okay, I need to make sure I'm not making any students. So I went in, I actually listened on YouTube. There's actually videos of people who are older, or it was actually either ordinary people. That's a very old film from the 20s and 30s of them speaking, or else an older person in a more modern period speaking, because I didn't want to go to the modern interpretation of the dialect, but to go back to how it would have sounded at the time. So that I did a little bit of phonetics just to kind of make sure I was just hearing it in my head the right way, but also keeping in mind that she's a chameleon. She's somebody who has existed and had to adapt to a lot of different environments. And so the voice that she tells this story to you, the reader, is a little bit different from the voice she employs when she's talking to people from her hometown, which is a little bit different than the voice she employs speaking to people at the upper end of society, and also different from the voice she speaks to the man who is her lover and then her husband, Oliver Anson Marshall, the Prohibition agent. So we sort of see and hear all these voices, and you might say that the more authentic voice is that sort of narrative voice in which she is telling the story to you, the reader. And that is something that, like I said, it is a bit like slipping into his skin. It's a bit like I did, some acting when I was younger, and it is that same experience of becoming a character. And I think the beauty, and a lot of my characters have a little bit of that sort of spirit in them that Jin has. They are a bit transgressive. They are a bit wily in the way they speak to you, because they're not, I don't want to sort of go back to the trope of the unreliable narrator, but they can be a bit unreliable. They're obviously telling you their story. So they're not always going to tell you, they're going to tell you, to use the modern term, which you should never ever use when you're writing historical fiction. But I can use it describing the historical fiction. They're telling their truth. So you always have to keep that in mind, that their truth is not necessarily the truth. And whenever you hear anybody telling their truth, it is not always the truth. So, from an objective, Enlightenment rationalist standpoint, you have to keep that in mind with Jin. She's going to tell the story as she sees it. And, the inflections that she has, like I said, the syntax, the grammar, the sort of lyricism with which she speaks, that's all gathered from her home base, from her hometown, and how she then braids that into, the more formal modes of speech that she also has access to, that is kind of the uniqueness of Jin's voice. And to me now, it comes so naturally. When I sat down to write this book, I was not actually under contract for it. It sits a bit awkwardly with some of my other books. And so we had sort of known that eventually we wanted to get back to this series. And I knew I was going to write a third book. I just had to figure out how I was going to explain this to my editor and agent that this was going to have to happen. And it was at the end of last summer, the COVID summer, and I was feeling really I tend to be a very optimistic person, but I was certainly not, I had a case of the blues at the end of last summer. I think it was very tough for all of us writing, all of us who had a book out, and to feel that what we were doing was, it was overshadowed by events that were taking place in the larger world. And that combined with all the stress of COVID and my family's emotional health and various other things, I was really at the end of the summer, like not sleeping well, not happy, tense, anxious, everything. And I thought, I think it's time to write that third book right now. And that's what I did. And like I said, slipping into Jin's voice was so easy. It was taking on a role that I knew so well, a character I knew so well. I think when you're writing a fresh book, the advantage of writing in a series, you already know these characters. I'm writing a book now that is brand new characters. Don't worry, there's connections to the Skylar world. But I'd forgotten how hard it is to get to know new characters again, and how that really slows you down because it's like somebody you don't know very well. There's that kind of awkwardness of conversation trying to get to the truth of them. But this was like, and I truly, by the time I finished the book, and it was about 8 weeks of writing, of just blissful, rapturous, get up early in the morning and write kind of writing, it was to inhabit these characters again. Let's not forget poor Ella. Ella gets overshadowed so much, first by her mom growing up, and then by Jin telling her story. But both of these characters, I know them so well. I know what's in their hearts. I know what comes out of their mouths. I know all their friends and relations. It is such a joy to return to that I don't need to think about voice. And I think voice, when it's done well, you don't need to think about it. You do your research, you think about the character develops in your head, and the voice is how you communicate characterization to the audience. And that is the point of Jin's voice, is to tell you who she is. And of course, Ella as well. As voice is not as distinctive, obviously, but again, it's through her voice that you understand who she is. And that is why voice, to me, and I'm so glad you asked it as one of the first questions, because it is so vital to me as a writer, because I think it's like maybe the number one tool in my toolbox for communicating those essential parts of fiction, which is, who is this person and why should I care about him or her?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. What an amazing answer. Thank you.
I know you don't need to prompt me. I think it's because I spend most of my day dealing with, matter of fact stuff. Ask me a question about writing and I am off, No,
it's perfect. It makes my job easy. So I'll take it. Wait, so you used the word transgressive earlier to talk about narrative voice, specifically the unreliable narrator in terms of Jin specifically, but also Ella, and every character has their own truth. You also mentioned loving to write these strong female complex characters. So let's talk about flawed and fierce women.
Oh yes, my favorite kind.
Oh, my favorite kind too. And they're not always everyone's favorite kind, although certainly.
Well, I do get these nice letters from very lovely people who, I love your book until I got to all the F-bombs, don't you understand that profanity is a sign of little creativity? I'm like, actually, it's the opposite. I find that people who swear the most fluently are really the ones who are really creative and interesting. I'm not a big, I let it all out in my characters. I'm actually a goody two shoes myself, which is why my characters are so transgressive, I think, because it's like the me that I could be if I dared, or if I didn't care so much what everyone thinks of me, So, I think that it's funny. I think a lot of the women who write flawed, fierce female characters, and Kate Quinn and I have this discussion sometimes, we're both like such goody two shoes, we try to come off with our, drinking on, our Instagram posts of cocktails as being these but actually we're not. It's an exciting day out, really exciting day out when I have a cocktail. So I do like wine with dinner, but but yeah, so it's funny how these characters are so appealing to us as women, because a lot of times when we encounter them in real life, we don't like them as much. They're tough to deal with. They tend to suck all the attention in the room. And that can be good and bad. But I think women, we kind of like when we are involved in our own human relations, our job traditionally, what we've been socialized is to keep everybody happy, to keep everybody getting along. And here comes these women, and they just want to rock the boat. They want people to not get along. They want to ask, well, why are we doing this way? And I want to do something differently. I have a high sex drive and I want to sleep with men. What is wrong with that? I like to have, I'm hurting inside, and this is how I express my pain. All these things are so fascinating to us, and they're wonderful to read about. It's like I said, it's harder to deal with somebody like that in real life because they can be a real pain in the neck, but they are also the people who get things done. If we are talking, this is something I sort of bring up later in the book, if we look at World War II, and we love reading these books about women resistance heroines, and we see ourselves in that person, we would be the one hiding the Jewish family in the basement, and we would be the one, couriering the documents, and we'd be the one hiding people and fighting the Gestapo. But no, you wouldn't, like 99% of people just tried to stay alive. And it's that 1% of people, those fierce, difficult women that are difficult to deal with in real life, but who have the nerve to, because if you look at, say, Germans, it's of course not every, the Nazis got in with something like 30% of the vote. They didn't have a majority, but because they were able to intimidate people into keeping their mouths shut because they were afraid. They didn't want to go against what their neighbors were thinking. They didn't want to be the one who had the thoughts that were bad. And they didn't want to be the one who, was going to not just face, potential arrest, but also just the disapproval of your neighbors, so we're paralyzed by that kind of thing. So it's really only that 1%. We may privately disagree, but it's really only that 1 to 2 to maybe 5% of people who are willing to put their lives, their comfort, their safety on the line and defy the status quo. And that is why these women are so important and so fascinating, so interesting to read about. They're the women we wish we could be. Some of us are, I'm not saying none of us are, but they're also the women who give us the courage to do those things, even if they go against everything that, is in our own nature about being good and bad. So that's why I love writing about them. They're very dear to my heart. And, I will just, and I think particularly the 20s, 30s, 40s were great. The reason there's such great periods to write about with these women is because that is when that transgressive woman finally had more of a voice. There wasn't, especially in the case of the 1920s, and because in large part of what happened in World War I, there wasn't quite as much, social disapproval that was dumped on women who were transgressive. Suddenly she became somebody interesting. She became the flapper. So, by giving women role models or just kind of permission to be more transgressive, we discovered that, hey, there actually are women who don't just want to follow the rules or kind of do, but hey, if there's a little opening there where they don't have to follow the rules, maybe they won't, so it's inspirational. And I think it gives us, the courage to be a little bit transgressive ourselves. And, I think that's why, particularly now in the modern day, these books have become, I think, so fascinating and important, I think, to readers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you hit on something with the 20s and the flappers, and suddenly
Yeah.
women, have this
Having permission to be
yeah.
naughty. Yeah. That's a new thing. You could argue that, maybe the Regency period, a century earlier, celebrated some naughty women, but not really. I mean, it was still very hard to operate outside the bounds of, of social norms that were in place. Part of it was, the fact that there were consequences. If in a society with no safety net, if you broke the rules and lost all your money or got pregnant or whatever, this was a big problem. It was a huge burden on your family, on society. So there are reasons why we had these social norms, because the repercussions of bad behavior were sometimes very, very high. And as we sort of managed to make the repercussions be less and less, it gave people permission to do things that they wanted to do, rather than having to always follow the rules and having to to stay within the bounds of these social rules and norms.
Yeah, and we can talk about that as it pertains to writing and parenthood and career, all the things that you encompass, in your own personality. But let's talk a little bit about being a best-selling author, a mother of 4 children, somebody who has had a very rich career in finance and communication and analysis. So all of these things that are challenging to balance and if not impossible to balance. It's something I'm particularly interested in as a woman writer with a small child. And we talked about this a little before the interview. So talk a little bit about the logistics of juggling all of these aspects of your life and career.
Well, it was harder logistically when obviously my children were younger, and when I wrote my first book, my youngest was, I think, just about to turn a year old, and she's now 13. So obviously big difference there. I had my first 2 when we were living in London, and we hired a baby nurse to help us out, because I didn't have any family with me. I had no support structure whatsoever. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And so we had a baby nurse come for the first 3 weeks to okay, how do you establish a routine and blah, blah, blah. I'm someone who needs my sleep, and, man, all my kids were sleeping really solidly well at night from a very early age, and had set nap schedules that we kept to, and we didn't Ferberize them or anything. We just encouraged that and set them up for success in the evening when we put them down, kind of a thing. All these great tips and things that we got from that. So that was a blessing. And it also gave me periods in the day when I knew I could write. When I sort of decided I really don't want to do this finance thing, I want to be transgressive and drop all that now and do what I really wanted to do all along, which was to write. And so I had nap time when I could write, but also, the kids went to bed at 7 p.m. And, unless there was, disease in the house or something, generally speaking, we could count on them to stay asleep. And so those sort of hours from, say, 7 p.m. to 10 p.m., 11 p.m. were my time to write. And, this is also before the rise of the smartphone. Didn't have as many distractions, didn't have all the marketing and social media things that I think take up a lot of our time as writers. I would almost argue at this point in my life that the social media and business of writing aspects take up more of my time and attention and suck up more of my creativity and what's the word I'm thinking of here? They just suck up more of my drive and energy, and all that creative excitement that should go into my book sometimes ends up not with necessarily my kids, who are now pretty well able to, get themselves, study time and get to school and all that on their own. It's actually that segment of it to me that now is the big challenge, is how do I keep my creativity where it belongs, which is in my stories. So, the juggling of it was certainly helped early on by the fact that my kids were good sleepers, and we encouraged that from a young age. And I had these blocks of time that if you cut out television, instead of sitting in front of the TV, I would sit in front of my computer and write. That facilitated that. Now that my kids are up later and so on, it's less, it's not as easy, but I've discovered that time, and I just did, everything's later. But I've discovered that in the morning, as soon as the kids are off to school, using that morning time is a great way to get the momentum going. And the challenge there again, get the phone out of the room. Don't, for God's sake, open your emails. Don't do any of that. Just sit down with the coffee and write. And I'm not always good at that. The discipline is not always there. The discipline has to be there. It all starts with just that personal discipline. Once you get into the story, you're fine. You're off and running. But to take that first, it's like taking a plunge, especially if it's a book that you're in that challenging phase of the writing, it's like taking a plunge into the cold water, but you have to do it. And then suddenly the water feels warm and you're fine and you're swimming and it's all good. But it is that discipline of just sitting down and making yourself do it and cutting out the distractions. That is the challenge. And I think that is something that I'm not going to speak for everyone as a whole. I'm not going to make this a blanket statement, but certainly most of the women writers I know who also have families, this is a challenge more unique to them than to male writers who have families. I think there is, and it partly has to do with the mystique that society enshrouds male writers with, and that they enshroud themselves with in many cases, that he is a genius creating sublime work, and we should all do his laundry and cook his dinners and pay his bills and keep the children away while he does his sacred work. Whereas I think female writers, there are obviously exceptions, we kind of have to do all that stuff before we can write. And I think that is the challenge, certainly with, Karen White and Lauren Willig. We are constantly on our text chats complaining about this, how we have to put everything else first before we can write. And I think that male writers, again, I'm generalizing. I don't mean every male writer. I'm not, and this is not a j'accuse, in any way, tend to get a little bit more of that space to write in. And that is, I think, the challenge for us, to have that undistracted. And it's partly our female brains tend to be wired to be making lists in our heads and to-do lists and keeping everything running. I think we just have much more of a challenge eliminating the distractions and taking that plunge into the story and making it work. But I think in some ways, it makes us better writers, more attuned to the details of everyday life, and more, I think, able to take advantage of packets of time in which we can do the 20-minute creative plunge, be thinking about the book in the back of our heads while we're working on something else, and then sit down and do it when we have the moment in front of our computers. So, I think that's kind of how it's done, but, I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm still figuring this out. And I have periods of wild, rapturous creativity, as when I was writing this book, and periods where, I will do anything to avoid writing the book. So, I think it just all begins and ends with that discipline. And I don't think people understand, who are sort of at the beginning stage of wanting to write a book, understand that it is not a question of the muse visiting you and words of genius flowing out of you. It is definitely a question of discipline, sitting down at the computer, pushing away the distractions, which are so so much a part and parcel of our lives as women, and get to writing that book, but to use all that stuff as our superpower when we do get to write.
I love that, the idea of the superpower. Laundry is a superpower, right?
It is, because, you can sit there, as you don't, if you're at a problem part of the book where you can't figure out what happens, or you can't figure out this character or how these two characters are interacting, you can't break their code for some reason. as soon as you get up and do something else, it comes to you.
Yeah.
And I think that by doing things like, so many plot points have come to me when I have been folding laundry. It is a great creative moment, but you just have to focus your mind on the book while you're folding the laundry. I hesitate to say this, I don't want to cause any car accidents here, but when you're driving the car, often that's a time to kind of have the book in the back of your head, as long as you're still paying attention. It's just in the back of your head. Just a lot of the mundane chores of parenthood and keeping the house running, I think, actually can serve you well if you then focus your mind on the book, on the story. So many times I have been stuck. I've gotten up to fold the laundry, and I'm unstuck. So, or make more coffee. That's also good. Unload the dishwasher. That's a good one.
Yeah.
So you just, again, you have to try and use these things as forces for good, instead of things that obstruct you from the writing. But again, I think it's easy to be, I think, as women, sort of jealous of the male author and his ability to create these sacred spaces in which to write. But I think, again, it's something that it's, we can complain all we like, and we certainly do, but you have to turn it around and try to figure out, okay, well, how can I make this work for me instead of against me? And I think that's something that we as women are very good at doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to talk about thinking, what am I trying to say? Redefining writing, right? So like you can be writing and folding laundry at the same time if you're thinking about your book and if you're puzzling through your plot hole.
That is the biggest part. Yeah.
Exactly. So
taking a walk, going running. I go running 4 mornings a week. And I try to keep to that, if it's bad weather day and I really can't go out. The only thing that I really is like when it's pouring down rain, because it's just so miserable. But like I'll go out when it's snowing. My husband got me the best gift last Christmas. He got me these like strap-on, like what do they call them? The crampons, whatever they call them, the spikes anyway, that you can strap on that are specifically for ice and snow. And so it's actually a really good workout, because it's like a beach run, you're really having to work for every stride, but it gets you out on the road. And that, again, I no AirPods, no nothing, no music, just the voices in my head. In a good way. And, and it's 4 miles. It's half an hour and I'm back, and then I take the hot shower. So between the running and the shower, and just like, the grooming rituals, I sit down in front of the computer, and if I've done it right, if I've been thinking about the right things and channeling my mind into the book, I usually have something to write when I sit down.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes it's getting away from the page that brings you back to it. So
exactly. Staring at the page, sometimes it's not going to help.
No. You mentioned earlier that writing was what you always wanted to do, and you left finance for writing. Tell me a little bit about that earlier career and that transition from finance to literature. And then what, if anything, although no, definitely, I'm not going to say what, if anything, and what you brought from finance into because if you all have read these books, you'll see some of that career coming into your stories.
Indeed. So, I guess it kind of a little bit goes back to being the goody two shoes and the kind of the perfectionist. And, I went to college, and my father, and he's always been very supportive. But his sort of, he's also British. He grew up in London. He was actually born in Calcutta. And then they, moved back to England when India got its independence. So he grew up in post-war suburban London, which was, by the way, like the worst weather. Like those post-war years had terrible weather. There was still rationing. I think he did actually have to go uphill both ways to school and back, the whole thing. And so he, and then boarding school when he was 8 or whatever, ripped them out of their mother's arms and tossed them into, the cold Scottish dormitory kind of thing. And so he's very realistic, and he's very like, well, many are called, few are chosen, and just the idea that, look, a lot of people want to write, and, you have to find out how to make a living at it. And that's a challenge, because, it was never a question that I was going to get financial support after college. It was like, okay, you have loans. We paid for, as much as we could of your college tuition. So, I was like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to have a successful career, and I'll just kind of keep the writing on the side. And eventually at some point I will, out of my hat, produce this masterpiece. And then I will be the writer that I always wanted to be. And so luckily, my father's an engineer, and I've always actually had pretty good balance with my right and left brain. So the creativity, but also I do have a lot of analytical ability, which I think helps me with the plotting side of it. And I guess you could say the architecture of the story, which if you've done it right, should be invisible, but there should be a very solid arc. Especially if you're going to do a book that is plot heavy, it's got to have a really good symmetrical architecture that's going to hold everything up. So I've been good at that. I've also had stories that involved things like, physics and flight and things like that. Science is not something I'm scared of. It's not something that is a foreign language to me. It comes to me very naturally. And finance as well. When I went into it was really because, okay, I need a job after college, and these are jobs that are readily available and pay money. So I sort of went first into investor relations, which is kind of a combination of public relations and finance. Eventually, my husband was on Wall Street. All his family were on Wall Street, including the in-laws. So I kind of naturally ended up in business school, getting an MBA in finance. That's what everyone else was doing, and worked as a management consultant for financial institutions when we were in London. So it's sort of European banking clients. And I actually enjoyed the analytical aspect of going through Ella, I share this with Ella, there is this puzzle aspect to it. There is this kind of investigative thing where you're, everything, all actually the beauty of a balance sheet and an income statement, a cash flow, is they all are supposed to work together. And so by seeing where they don't work together, you can figure out where things are going wrong. Either your calculations are wrong, or the data going into them is wrong, or something else is going on. So I love that aspect of it, that analytical aspect of it. This was not something I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It was interesting from a puzzle perspective. And history, I always adored. Writing was always my strength, whatever I was doing. So, I think taking what I learned on the finance side and bringing it, I think, again, you take something that could have kind of held you back a bit, having been in this more analytical career, and you make it a strength. I can talk very comfortably about Wall Street culture, about how things work at investment banks, how things work in companies, and also how you track down criminal activity through financial statements, or just carelessness or negligence or all the other things that can go wrong inside a company and its books. That's something I love bringing to my books, because, I think this is a slice of life, and it is a way of investigating a mystery that I think is not something we see as often in this particular segment of the literary world, historical fiction, prohibition fiction, mysteries, crime, it tends to be much more on the sort of the physical crime side. Bringing that, expertise to Ella's side and her relationship with her ex-husband, and what, the fact that malfeasance that occurred decades earlier you can find traces of it in the financial dealings of the present day, to me was something that was very appealing. And I think I was glad to be able to bring that with a certain amount of security that I knew that what I was talking about as I was writing it.
Yeah, and I love that it's, again, going back to the fierce female characters, but a woman who tracks this down, a woman also who, I don't think this spoils anything, but is pregnant. So we have the mother who is tracking down this financial criminal activity. It's very compelling. And like you said, it's not something you see very often in this area of literary fiction, but also female characters, tracking down financial mysteries is not something you see very often. It's fabulous. I see that Abby just rejoined us up here, I think.
Yes. And that means you've been yammering on long enough.
Well, actually, you guys just led so beautifully and succinctly into the question I was going to lead off with, which was kind of stemming from the sort of ongoing discussion we've been having about, difficult and transgressive women. And I feel it's one you could both speak to, actually. Can you talk about the female protagonists that have had a great influence on you and your work?
Oh gosh, it's interesting that I would almost say that the female protagonist that I think had the most effect on me as a writer, and I would say this is almost more in terms of what I write about than necessarily how I view women and so on. It was when I was in college and I was taking a course in turn of the century European history. So kind of the years leading up to World War II and all these elements of modernism that were bubbling up on the fringes of the culture. So we have this 19th century capital R romantic culture that has been the dominant cultural force really sort of since the end of the Regency, and now all of a sudden you have these new ideas coming up, and then you have World War II come along, and it's a bit like a crucible into which all these ingredients kind of come together and are forged into what we would call, the modern world. So this was it was a fascinating class for me, because obviously you can sort of imagine having a British father who went to boarding school and all these things. I had a very strong grounding growing up in 19th century British literature and art and so on. So, and that was kind of my home base where I felt comfortable. This class was a bit of an eye opener for me. And then we sort of get to World War I. And the text that we were reading was Vera Britton's war memoir, Testament of Youth. And I had really never read anything like this before, because it was about, at first you have, what starts out as your traditional Victorian love story, even if she's a bit independent. She wants to go to Oxford, but she's very smart. She's definitely, very much in the 19th century tradition of the young woman who doesn't really fit in with her surroundings. And here is this fascinating young man who finds her special. And that everything's going along exactly as you would expect. And they fall in love. And then it's the summer of 1914. And of course, the war breaks out, and no spoilers here, he dies. Within a year, Christmas of 1915, he's on the Western Front, not far from Albert in France, and is just shot through the stomach by a sniper with an exploding bullet and dies in agony 24 hours later. While she is expecting him home for Christmas, she's supposed to get the phone call saying he's landed for his Christmas leave. She instead gets the phone call that he's dead. And then one by one, her brother and all his friends die. And I'm like, this is not how it's supposed to go. This is not the story that I'm used to reading. And it opened my eyes, not just because of this literal shift that happens between the 19th century novel and the 20th century novel and how these things play out, but just, wow, here is a moment in history that is a transition point. And it sets us on this arc of the 20th century that leads to what people call the end of the 20th century, which is 1989, which is when communism finally throws in the towel. And, and so that period, 1914 to 1989, is a sort of abbreviated 20th century. And all of a sudden, to me, it was like, wow, this is such a powerful story. How we got there, how this arc played out because of all these, all these little set pieces that were carefully, randomly yet seemingly carefully put in place, right up to the entry into World War I. And Vera's story of living this tradition, this life, of that seemed so laid out for her, and having everything completely get blasted to hell and having to rebuild her life after that and find something to live for and hope for, I think, and her courage in doing so, and being in some ways very traditional and provincial, and yet having the energy and ambition to sort of break all those bonds one by one. And she's not always a likable person. She's definitely the kind of person you sort of sense when she gets to Oxford, you're like, she doesn't really have any friends. And is that because she's just so mired in grief, or she's just like kind of a bit of a bitch? You don't really actually want to hang out with her. But she makes a great character. She makes somebody that, inspired and informed a lot of my ideas about how my characters should be and how their lives are going to play out against this backdrop that has, that history has created for them. So, she's actually a real person, not a fictional protagonist, but she is certainly a protagonist, and not just in the sense of the book being about her, but about the way she takes charge of this disastrous situation. And instead of becoming somebody that things happen to, she becomes a person who makes things happen. So for that, I think it's probably the most, again, my long-winded answer, she's certainly the most influential character for me in terms of what I ended up writing, and, how my whole idea of what I should be writing ended up, playing out.
I love your
obviously like Anne of Green Gables and all the classics of children's literature are probably all in there as well. I still haven't, I still haven't created Gilbert, but recreated Gilbert, but maybe at some point that will.
I love that. What about you, Lara? Any shout outs, big female protagonist influences?
Yeah, I'll take the back door of that question and say that I love, Beatrice, what you said about sort of what you thought you should be writing, and how it takes a while to break out of that and find what you want to be writing and what you need to be writing. And growing up, I read a lot of books about men and boys because that's what I felt I should be reading, right? Like great literature is about and by men. Of course, that's not true. And I'm not sure I consciously thought that as a young person, but the books I read certainly played into that. And then the books I started to try to write were based on those types of books. So the first book I finished, which is not published, was a young adult novel from the point of view of a young boy. And it was very much based on like Lord of the Flies and A Separate Peace and all of these books about like this bubble in which young men come of age. And that book, although I had an agent and we went to publishers and everything, it didn't end up published, and I'm glad it didn't, because then I sort of realized that there was this wealth of literature by and about women that is just as literary, just as vital, just as important and transgressive as these books by and about men that I had grown up reading. And I realized that I asked myself, why am I writing about boys? Why am I writing from the point of view of a 14-year-old boy? When what I have to say is just as valid and just as big as some of the subjects that you find in these other books. So it took me a long time to kind of find those female touch points and those female protagonists. And I think of the women now who are in those books. They're embedded in those books I grew up reading, and they're not the protagonists, like Molly Bloom in Ulysses, who is relegated to this like one chapter. Yes, it's the last chapter and she has the final word, but in that vast book, she's got this one little chapter. And then in Rabbit Run, the poor wife who's this alcoholic woman struggling with postpartum depression, who, hopefully this doesn't spoil it for anybody, but ends up killing her own child accidentally. At the end of the book, it's like you have this whole journey of this man, and at the end the wife has this one tragic moment. I want to read a book about her. I want to read a book about Molly Bloom, and I want to read a book about all these women who were kind of like shoved to the end of the books. So those are the protagonists I think of now, and the protagonists I go back to as I'm writing my own books. I want to write big, unwieldy stories about messy, flawed women. So that's kind of where my next book is headed.
And it's such an interesting thing, because when we're right, and if you look at the 19th century, actually so much of, what I read as a kid, I read the canon, but the canon was so, you had the Little House books, read all those, you had Anna Green, these were so much, even the Wizard of Oz books, it was a male author, but you had, primarily female characters who are in the stage. And it's interesting that when you shift to 20th century fiction and modernist fiction, all of a sudden it's the men who have decided that this art form, the novel, which was something that was considered very feminine back, they kind of take it and they remake it in their own image. And what is considered good writing and good fiction, well, no sentimentality. We can't have sentimentality. That's awful, and all they kind of take the novel and remake it in their image, and it becomes by and about men. So women have to go into sort of genre type directions, romance and things like that, to have a voice anymore at the table, and if you think of the sort of the great works of fiction of the 20th century, so much of them, and the great, monumental writers, they tend to be men. They tend to be books by and about men. So, but, luckily I was never interested in that growing up. I was still back in the 19th century, and the sort of the novel, which was mostly about women. Even male writers were writing about women. I mean, if you look at Thackeray, and he's just writing about women. And if you go back further to the 18th century, you have, Richardson and Fielding, they're mostly writing about women, and even if you look at operas, Wagner was writing about men, but Verdi, but the Italians were all their successful stuff was about women. I mean, it was really, the woman was the core of all these stories. So I love the fact that, we actually do have this tradition where women are taking major roles, and we squashed it. We kind of let the boys take it over. And I'm like, no, we need to go back to that, pluck the women out. I love that thing about, the side stories of women. I think sometimes, I'm a huge opera nut, and I'd have to bring this up because I understand that, there's not a lot of reference points here, but someone, like Aida is a fabulous story. It's just a great love triangle, and the way everything kind of comes together to this tragic conclusion. But I told my agent this, and she's like, you can't do it. I will not let you write this. But I'm like, I really want to write about Amneris, and she's like she's the transgressive, she's kind of the bitch of the story. And I'm like, what happens to Amneris after Radames and Aida die in the tomb and she's consumed with guilt because it's her fault? What does she do? And I'm like, she goes off and wanders in the Nile Valley and has all these adventures and things and renounce. And so I love this idea of taking these women who were what I call the mezzo soprano role, the troublemaker role, and digging deeper into them and what happened to them and who were they and what do they do after the opera is over. So that's my pet project that my agent will never let me do, because she's like, no one cares about.
You have to write this. I care. I want to read this.
That sounds so great. Oh my God. I knew this would be like an absolutely riveting conversation. And like,
I feel like Lara and I need to go and have drinks somewhere and just really have like hour 2 of this discussion.
Yes, make it happen. This was wonderful. Thank you both so much. We covered like truly, I think every like major topic that we could have talked about. It was absolutely spectacular. I just want to remind our audience that we do have a limited number of signed copies of The Wicked Widow. So if you haven't already purchased, get on that, because signed books are great.
Postcards and bookmarks in them. So
yes, all that swag. Beatrice is the queen of swag. Yeah, so it's been absolutely lovely. I was honored to host you two. I'm gonna let y'all have the last word.
Well, I just want to thank Lara for her amazing work as, as trying to corral this conversation before it got, before we went too far afield. So thank you so much. And I can't wait. And now I have to pick up a copy of Animal Wife and read about this. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. And it was my pleasure to corral the conversation. It needed no corralling. It was just a pleasure. So thank you so much. And thank you, Abby. And thank you all for tuning in. Read the book. It's just so much fun.
Thank you.
Have a great night,
Bye,
guys.
everyone.